For 3,652 mornings, a basket of food appeared outside a beggar's door. Every single day, for 10 years, without fail. The village called him the cursed one, the poorest, weakest man alive. They mocked him. They ignored him. Only one woman never looked away. She never asked why. She never asked for anything back. What she didn't know was that the man behind that door wasn't cursed. He was hidden, and the secret he carried could burn her entire village to the ground. This is the story of a debt 10 years in the making, and the day it finally came due. In the village of Dornmere, kindness had a price. Everyone knew this, even the children. So when 8-year-old Alira first noticed the man in the crumbling hut at the edge of the forest, she also noticed something else. Nobody looked at him. Not with hatred, not with pity, with nothing at all, as if looking cost too much. They called him the beggar. Some called him the cursed one. He had appeared in Dornmere 10 winters before Alira was even born, wandering out of the dark tree line with no name, no memory, and wounds that should have killed him twice over. The elders decided he was bad luck given human shape, and bad luck, once named, is easy to ignore. So the village fed its pigs better than it fed him. Children threw stones at his door for sport. Alira watched this happen one gray morning, and something in her small chest twisted painfully, the way it does when you see something break that no one else seems to notice is breaking. She did not understand why she cared. She only knew that when the other children ran off laughing, she stayed behind, picked up the heel of bread her mother had given her for lunch, and set it gently on the stranger's doorstep. She did not knock. She did not wait to see his face. She simply left it there, the way you might leave water for a wounded animal too frightened to be touched, and walked away with her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't name. The next morning, the bread was gone. That was the beginning of something Alira herself did not fully understand for a long, long time. She kept coming back. Not every day at first, just when she could spare something, a boiled potato, a strip of dried fish, once even a small, warm meat pie she had been saving for herself. She never saw him eat. She never saw him at all, not clearly. Only a shape moving in the shadows past the doorway. Only a pair of eyes that seemed to watch her from the darkness with an intensity that made her breath catch, though she could never explain why. There was something in those eyes, not menace, something closer to disbelief, as though no one had ever done something like this for him before, and he did not know what to do with it. Her mother scolded her more than once. That man is cursed, Alira. Feed him, and the curse follows you home. Her father simply sighed and said nothing, which was worse. The other village girls whispered about her strange obsession with the beggar, giggling behind their hands, calling her odd, calling her wasteful. Alira let them talk. She had decided, in the quiet, stubborn way children sometimes decide things that adults spend a lifetime forgetting, that a person is a person, cursed or not, and no one deserves to starve in silence while an entire village looks away. Years folded into each other the way rivers fold into the sea, quietly and all at once. Alira grew. Her hands, once too small to carry a full basket, grew calloused from farm work. Her voice deepened from a child's chirp into something steadier, warmer. Her heart, somehow, never changed. Every evening, rain or frost or fever, she walked the same worn path to the same crooked door and left a basket of whatever she could spare. She never received a thank you. Not once in all those years did the man behind the door speak a single word to her. And yet, she would tell herself, walking home under a darkening sky, there was something in the way the basket was always empty by morning, always set neatly back beside the door instead of tossed aside, that felt like a kind of conversation neither of them knew how to have out loud. She began to notice things, small and strange, the way you notice cracks in a wall you've stared at your whole life. The man never seemed to age. When she was 12, he looked no older than a man in his prime. When she was 22, he still looked exactly the same, as if time itself had quietly stepped around his door and continued on without him. Wolves howled in the forest every winter, close enough to send farmers locking their livestock indoors. But never once did an animal, wild or tame, come near his hut. Dogs that barked at everything went silent and stiff-legged when they passed it, tails tucked, refusing to go further. Once, delivering the basket during a storm. Elira saw deep gouges raked into the inside of his door, long, deliberate claw marks, 4 of them, evenly spaced, as though something enormous had clawed to get out, not in. She told no one. She was not even sure what she had seen, only that it frightened her in a way she could not fully name, and that, strangely, it did not stop her from returning the very next evening. There were other moments, too, smaller ones, the kind that live quietly in a person's chest for years before they understand their weight. A night she arrived late, breathless, apologizing under her breath for the delay, and swore, just for a heartbeat, that she heard him exhale, low and relieved, like a man who had been holding his breath in fear that she would not come at all. A winter evening, when she left an extra blanket folded beneath the basket, and the next morning found a single wildflower, one she did not recognize, resting exactly where the blanket had been. She kept it pressed between the pages of her mother's old prayer book for years, never telling a soul, never quite letting herself wonder what it meant that a man who never spoke, never showed his face, had somehow reached through 10 years of silence to leave her something back. By the time Elira was 22, feeding the stranger in the hut was no longer an act of pity. It had become, quietly and without her ever choosing it on purpose, the truest and steadiest relationship of her life, built entirely on food left at a door and a debt that had long since stopped being about hunger at all. Then came the night everything changed. She was later than usual, delayed by a sick calf on her family's farm, the basket heavier than normal because she'd added a bit of honeycomb she'd been saving. The moon was thin and pale overhead as she approached the familiar crooked door, her feet finding the worn path out of 10 years of habit. She was 3 steps away when the ground itself seemed to shudder. A growl rolled out from inside the hut. Low, enormous, inhuman, a sound that seemed to come from something far too large to fit inside those thin wooden walls. It vibrated in her chest before it even reached her ears. The basket slipped from her fingers and hit the dirt. Every instinct screamed at her to run, and for one terrible moment, she nearly did. Then, for the first time in 10 years, a voice came from behind that door, deep, ancient, and trembling with something that sounded almost like pain, almost like fear not for himself, but for her. "Run, now, before you see what I am." Elira stood frozen in the moonlight, her hand still outstretched toward a door she had opened, in her heart 1,000 times before. And for the first time, she had to decide whether 10 years of quiet devotion was about to end in the dark, or finally begin. Elira did not run. Every instinct in her body told her to. 10 years of quiet devotion had built something in her chest that felt too strong, too stubborn, to simply turn and flee now, at the very moment the truth finally seemed within reach. Her hand trembled on the rough wooden door. The growling inside had grown louder, deeper, shaking dust loose from the frame. And still, she pushed the door open. What she saw inside stole the breath from her lungs. Cale was on his knees in the center of the small room, his back arched, his hands pressed flat against the floor as though he were trying to hold the earth itself in place. His fingers were no longer fingers. They had lengthened into something else, dark claws curling from where nails should have been. Along his spine, coarse fur rippled beneath torn cloth, appearing and vanishing like a tide fighting its own shore. His eyes, when they lifted to hers, glowed a deep amber gold, no longer entirely human. And yet, underneath all of it, she recognized something achingly familiar. Fear, not of her, for her. "I told you to run," he rasped, his voice raw from 10 years of disuse, cracking under the strain of holding himself together. "I don't run from you," Elira whispered, though her legs shook beneath her skirts. "I never have." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, the shaking in his shoulders began to ease, as if her voice alone were an anchor pulling him back from some terrible edge. The claws receded. The glow in his eyes dimmed to something softer, something closer to grief. And for the first time in 10 years, Cale spoke to her not in fragments, but in full, aching sentences, as though a decade of silence had been a dam, and her presence had finally cracked it open. He told her the truth in pieces, each one heavier than the last. He was not cursed, he said. He was bound. 10 years ago, he had not stumbled out of the forest as a broken beggar by chance. He had been the alpha king of the wolf-born clans, ruler of a kingdom hidden deep beyond Dormir's forest, a man once trusted with the lives of thousands. His own council, men he had called brothers, had betrayed him in a single night, stripping him of his memory, his power, and his name, then casting him into the one place no one would ever think to search for a king, the poorest, most forgotten hut, in the poorest, most forgotten village in the land. They didn't want me dead, he said quietly, staring at his own trembling hands. Dead kings become martyrs. Legends. They wanted me erased. Forgotten. A curse whispered by frightened villagers instead of a name anyone would ever look for. Elira sank down onto the floor across from him, ignoring the dirt, ignoring the danger, ignoring everything except the man in front of her who had just handed her 10 years of silence in a single breath. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked, and there was no anger in her voice, only a quiet, aching hurt. "Because I couldn't," he said. "The binding they placed on me doesn't just steal my power. It punishes me if I speak my truth aloud, if I try to leave these borders, if I try to reclaim who I was. Every day I stayed silent. The binding stayed strong. Every day you came to that door and left me something to eat, something to hold on to. You were the only reason the silence didn't kill whatever was left of the man I used to be." The words settled over Elira like the first snowfall of a long winter, quiet and impossible to ignore. "Your food," Kale continued, his voice breaking on the word, "was never charity to me. It was proof. Proof that after everything I lost, kindness still existed somewhere in this world. That someone could look at someone with nothing and choose to give anyway, expecting nothing back. I have been a king surrounded by thousands who wanted something from me. You're the only person who ever gave without wanting anything at all." Elira felt her eyes sting. 10 years of unspoken devotion, finally finding an answer she had never dared to hope for. Before she could speak, before either of them could reach for whatever fragile thing was forming in the space between them, the ground trembled again. Not from Kale this time, but from something outside. The binding, weakened by his broken silence, had sent a ripple through the old magic that bound him, a ripple that could be felt and tracked by those who had placed it there. Far beyond the forest, in a cold stone hall lit by torchlight, a commander loyal to the bloodline that had betrayed Kale 10 years ago felt the pulse of returning power and smiled a thin, cruel smile. He gave the order to ride at once. Dormir, a village that had never mattered to anyone, was about to become the center of a war it never asked for. By the next evening, whispers had already begun crawling through the village like smoke. Someone had seen strange lights near the beggar's hut. Someone else swore they'd heard a beast's roar shaking the trees. Fear, once it starts moving through a small village, moves faster than truth ever could. By nightfall, a crowd had gathered outside Kale's hut, not with baskets of food, but with torches and pitchforks, their faces twisted with the particular cruelty of frightened people looking for someone to blame. "He's a monster," someone shouted. "He's brought a curse on all of us," another cried. Voices rose, overlapping, fueled by 10 years of quiet resentment, finally given an excuse to become violence. Elira stepped between the crowd and the door without a second thought, her arms spread wide, her voice shaking but unbroken. "He has done nothing to any of you in 10 years. You fed your fear instead of your neighbor, and now you want to burn the one man among us who never hurt a single soul." Some villagers hesitated. A few lowered their torches, ashamed. But fear is a stubborn thing, and the crowd did not fully retreat. Just as the tension threatened to boil over into violence, a new sound cut through the night. The low, distant blast of war horns, rolling over the hills like a warning no one in Dormir had ever heard before. Every head turned toward the village gates. Torchlight flickered against approaching steel. Rows of armored riders, banners bearing a crest none of the farmers recognized, but all of them instinctively feared. At the front, A commander in dark armor reined in his horse, his cold eyes sweeping over the trembling village before settling, unmistakably, on the crooked little hut at its edge. "Bring me the king," he called out, his voice carrying easily over the frightened silence of the crowd. "Or the whole village burns tonight." The commander's words hung over Dornmere like smoke that would not clear. "Bring me the king, or the whole village burns tonight." For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, heads began to turn, not toward the soldiers, but toward the crooked little hut at the edge of the village, and toward the door still standing open behind Alira. She felt the weight of every eye in Dornmere land on her, and for the first time in 10 years, she understood that the secret she had carried alone, quietly, one basket at a time, was no longer hers to protect in silence. She stepped forward, her voice steady even as her heart pounded against her ribs. "His name is Kale," she said, loud enough for the whole crowd to hear. "For 10 years, he has lived among you, harming no one, asking for nothing, while you spat at his door and called him cursed. I fed him because he was a person, not because I knew what he was. And I would do it again, even now, knowing everything." A ripple of shame passed through the crowd. A few villagers lowered their eyes. An old woman who had once told Alira she was wasting good food on a cursed man now stood silent, her torch trembling in her grip. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. A crack in 10 years of fear. Behind her, Kale stepped out of the hut for the first time in a decade, into open moonlight, into the sight of the people who had mocked him for so long. He did not look like a beggar anymore. Something in the way he held himself had changed. His spine straighter, his eyes clearer, though still fighting a battle no one else could see. The binding inside him was breaking, and breaking it fully meant risking the very thing he had feared since the night it was cast upon him. That once his full strength returned, the wolf inside him might return stronger than the man. "If I let this binding finish breaking," he murmured to Alira, low enough that only she could hear, "I don't know if I'll still be able to control what I become. I could save this village and lose myself in the same breath." Alira reached out and took his clawed, trembling hand without hesitation, the way she had left food at his door 1,000 times before, without expecting anything, without needing him to be anything other than exactly what he was. "Then don't do it alone," she said. "You were never alone. Not once in 10 years. You're not starting now." Something shifted in him at her touch. Not magic, not power, but something steadier, something that felt to him like the first solid ground he had stood on in a decade. The binding around his chest cracked further, but this time, instead of the wild, uncontrolled surge that had shaken his hut the night before, the power settled into him like water finding its level. Fur and claws rose along his arms, but his eyes stayed clear, amber gold, and entirely his own. For the first time in 10 years, Kale stood as both the wolf and the king, and neither one was fighting the other. The commander at the gate laughed, cold and short. "So the mutt finally remembers how to stand. It changes nothing. You are still outnumbered, still weak, still." He never finished the sentence. Kale moved before the commander's words fully left his mouth, faster than anything the villagers of Dormir had ever witnessed, closing the distance between the hut and the gate in the space of a few heartbeats. This was not the beginning of a war. It was not soldiers against soldiers or army against army. It was one man, one king, finally standing to answer for 10 years of betrayal in front of the only person who had ever stood by him without asking why. The fight that followed was short, brutal, and personal. The commander was skilled, but he had spent 10 years believing his enemy was broken, and that belief made him careless. Kale fought not with the wild fury of a beast, but with the precise, controlled strength of a king who remembered, piece by piece, exactly who he used to be. Steel met klauw. Fear met resolve. And when it was over, the commander lay defeated at Kale's feet, alive but stripped of his weapon and his arrogance, staring up at the man he had once helped erase from history. "Tell your masters," Kale said quietly, his voice carrying easily over the silent village, that the king they buried in the poorest hut of the poorest village is still standing. And tell them this village, and everyone in it, is under my protection now." The commander said nothing. He simply turned, gathered his remaining men, and rode back into the dark, defeated not by an army, but by a single man who had refused to stay buried. Silence fell over Dornmere, the kind of silence that comes after fear finally exhales. One by one, the villagers who had raised torches and pitchforks only hours before began to lower their heads, some out of shame, some out of a fear that had simply changed shape. But Cale did not want their fear. He had spent 10 years living beneath it, invisible and forgotten, and he had no interest in trading one kind of silence for another. "Rise," he said simply, looking out over the crowd. "I don't want you kneeling to me out of fear. I had enough of that before I ever came to this village. If you want to give me anything, give me what she gave me." He turned, his eyes finding Alira in the crowd, softening in a way that had nothing to do with kingship at all. Kindness, given without expecting anything in return. The villagers, uncertain but moved, slowly began to lower their weapons instead of their heads. Cale crossed the space between them until he stood directly in front of Alira, closer than he had ever dared to stand in 10 years of silence and shadows. For the first time, there was nothing hiding his face, nothing holding back his voice. "My name," he said softly, "is Cale Duskrend. I was a king before I was anything else to anyone in this village. But to you, I was simply a man someone chose not to forget. You didn't just keep me alive these 10 years, Alira. You kept me human, even when I wasn't sure I still was one. I don't have a kingdom to offer you tonight. I don't even fully know who I am beyond the man you fed at that door. But whatever I rebuild from here, I don't want to rebuild it without you standing beside me." Alira, who had spent 10 years giving without ever expecting anything back, found herself, for the first time, receiving something she had never dared to hope for. Not gratitude, not gold, but the truth freely given and a hand offered instead of hidden. She took it. Around them, Dormir began to breathe again, torches lowering, fear slowly loosening its grip on a village that had spent a decade looking away from the very man who would end up saving it. But far beyond the forest, in the same cold stone hall where the order to ride had first been given, a raven bearing a dark, unfamiliar crest landed silently on a windowsill, its eyes glinting in the torchlight. Word was already traveling to those who had cast Cale out 10 years ago. Word that the king they thought erased was not only alive, but standing, remembered, and no longer alone. The narrator's closing line settles over the final shot. For 10 years, one woman's quiet kindness kept the king alive in secret. Now that the world knew he still lived, the real question was no longer whether he would survive, but whether those who betrayed him once would ever truly let him rest.